If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know what city you're watching from. Let's continue. The flight landed at JFK International Airport shortly after 7 in the evening. Edward Miller adjusted his wristwatch, feeling the weight of exhaustion that had built up over 3 months of back-to-back travel. 3 months, 90 days away from home, closing deals, expanding his business, building a tech empire that was starting to gain international attention. Every meeting had a single purpose: to secure the future of Sophia, his 8-year-old daughter, the reason he woke up every day with renewed determination. The last leg of the trip had been particularly grueling. Dubai, Tokyo, London, and finally San Francisco. He had slept in luxurious hotels, eaten at Michelin-starred restaurants, and closed multi-million-dollar deals that would place his tech company, Miller Solutions, among the most promising in the world. But no professional achievement could fill the void of being away from home. Edward came from humble beginnings. He grew up in Queens, the son of a mechanic and a seamstress. He went to public school and earned a full scholarship to a private university. He graduated with a degree in computer engineering and founded his own company at 25. Miller Solutions started in a rented garage with 3 used computers. At 32, he met Marina, his first wife, a journalist specializing in innovation. They married quickly, and Sophia was born a year later. Those were the 3 happiest years of Edward's life. Then came the accident on the Merritt Parkway. Marina died instantly. Sophia, just 4 years old, was physically unharmed, but would forever carry the memory of that day. The next 2 years were the hardest. Edward threw himself into his work but always came home in time to put Sophia to bed. He hired Beatrice, an experienced nanny, and Irene to manage the house. Sophia started to smile again, to be a child once more. It was in this context that Veronica entered their lives. As his private driver navigated the bustling streets of New York City, Edward felt a mix of anxiety and happiness. He had called Veronica, his wife, as soon as the plane landed, but the call went straight to voicemail. He tried again. Nothing. She was probably busy, he thought, pushing aside any worry. Veronica had always been independent, organized, and capable of running the household with impressive efficiency. It was precisely this competence that had put him at ease during his long absences. He had met Veronica Hayes 2 years earlier at a charity gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She had appeared, elegant in a navy blue dress, her black hair perfectly styled. They were introduced during the cocktail hour, and Edward was struck by her intelligence and refined demeanor. She told him she worked as an image consultant for executives. Veronica seemed to understand exactly what Edward needed. She listened to his concerns about Sophia, offered sensible advice, and showed genuine interest. She was beautiful, sophisticated, but not intimidating. During the first few months of their relationship, she gradually won Sophia over. She brought gifts, asked about school, and watched cartoons with the little girl. Beatrice expressed some reservations, but Edward chalked it up to natural jealousy. They married 6 months after their first meeting. Veronica insisted they not sign a prenup, arguing for a full joint property agreement to show mutual trust. Edward agreed without hesitation. The first few months of marriage were peaceful. Veronica took over managing the house with impressive efficiency. When she suggested that Beatrice was getting too old to care for Sophia, Edward hesitated but eventually gave in. It was around this time that the first international trips began. The company was expanding, attracting European and American investors. Veronica was understanding, encouraging him, saying that Sophia would be fine under her care. The trips grew longer, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month. There were signs Edward failed to interpret. Irene trying to talk to him, always interrupted by Veronica. Mark, the gardener, commenting that Sophia seemed quieter. Carla, the cook, noticing the girl was eating less. But Edward, immersed in the corporate world, didn't connect the dots. The relationship evolved quickly. Veronica was attentive, knew exactly what to say, when to be present and when to give him space. Sophia, who was 6 at the time and still grieving the loss of her biological mother 2 years prior, seemed to accept Veronica naturally. There was no resistance, no conflict. Edward interpreted this as a sign he was making the right decision. They married 6 months later in a discreet ceremony in the garden of their mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut, an affluent suburb of the city. Now, as the car moved through the illuminated streets, Edward thought about the look on Sophia's face when she saw him. He imagined her running down the hall, shouting his name, jumping into his arms. He had brought presents, of course. An articulated doll from a shop in Tokyo, Swiss chocolates, a set of illustrated books he'd found in London. But he knew none of it mattered as much as his presence. Sophia always said the best gift was just having him around. The gate to the mansion opened automatically. The garden was impeccably manicured, the outdoor lights casting soft shadows on the precisely trimmed trees. Everything seemed to be in order. Edward got out of the car, grabbed his briefcase and walked to the front door. It was unlocked. He stepped inside, expecting to be greeted by the usual household buzz, the voices of Sophia and Veronica, maybe the sound of the TV in the living room, or soft music playing. Silence. A heavy, unsettling silence that didn't belong in that home. Edward frowned, left his briefcase in the foyer, and headed for the living room. The lights were off. He flipped the switch and looked around. Everything was tidy, clean, but something felt different. It took him a few seconds to realize what it was. The photographs, the frames that used to decorate the shelves, showing happy moments of Sophia, pictures from birthdays, family trips. They were all gone. In their place were arrangements of white flowers, minimalist vases, and cold, impersonal decorative objects. Edward felt a tightness in his chest. He walked to the staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time, heading for Sophia's room. The door was ajar. He pushed it open slowly, and what he saw left him paralyzed. The room, once filled with vibrant colors, drawings taped to the walls, stuffed animals scattered on the bed and children's books piled on the shelf, was now unrecognizable. The walls had been repainted a light gray. The child's bed had been replaced with a simple twin bed with stark, lifeless white sheets. There were no toys, no drawings, no trace of the cheerful child who lived there. Where was Sophia? Edward felt panic begin to rise. He rushed back down the stairs, calling his daughter's name. Nothing. He went through the kitchen, checked the office, the dining room. Empty. It was then that he heard a sound coming from the backyard, a muffled sound like something being dragged across a hard surface. He opened the glass door that led to the backyard and froze. The scene before him seemed unreal, as if torn from a nightmare. The yard was covered in a thin layer of ice, the result of an unusual cold snap that had hit the northeast in recent weeks, bringing temperatures down near freezing overnight. The crunchy grass under the icy layer glistened under the yellowish light of the garden lamps, creating a cruel and deceptive beauty. And there, in the middle of that frozen expanse, was Sophia, his daughter, his little Sophia, dragging a huge, heavy-duty trash bag that looked twice her size. The sound Edward had heard was exactly that, the thick plastic scraping against the frozen ground, producing a harsh noise that now sounded like auditory torture. She was wearing only a thin, white cotton t-shirt, stained with dirt and torn at the left sleeve. Her jeans were worn out, too big, held up at the waist by a makeshift shoelace belt. Her sneakers, which Edward recognized from the previous year, were ripped at the sides, exposing her toes to the cold. No coat, no gloves, no scarf, no protection whatsoever against the biting cold that made even the hardiest adults shiver. Edward couldn't move. His eyes registered every detail with a painful clarity that would be seared into his memory forever. Sophia's hands were red, swollen, her trembling fingers struggling to keep a grip on the mouth of the bag. There were visible cracks in her skin, some bleeding slightly, the blood forming small, dark spots that contrasted with the unnatural paleness of her skin. Her lips were purplish, chapped, and slightly parted as she gasped for air with the effort. She pulled the bag with difficulty, her feet slipping repeatedly, on the icy ground. Every step was a battle. She would move a foot, slip, regain her balance, and try again. Her small body was bent under the impossible weight, her shoulders tense, her muscles trembling, not just from the cold, but from complete physical exhaustion. Tears streamed silently down her face, freezing on her cheeks before they fell, leaving glistening trails that reflected the artificial light. She hadn't seen him yet. She kept dragging that impossible weight, her ragged breaths creating small clouds of vapor that dissipated quickly in the frigid air. Her eyes were fixed on the ground, focused only on taking the next step, on not giving up, on completing whatever incomprehensible task someone had imposed on a child who should have been inside, warm, fed, and protected. And then Edward saw the other figure, Veronica. She was sitting comfortably in a patio chair that had been moved to a covered area of the yard, shielded from the cold by a heated awning Edward didn't even know existed. She was wrapped in expensive wool blankets, the kind imported from Scotland that cost thousands of dollars. A glass of red wine was in her hand, the ruby liquid, contrasting elegantly with the delicate crystal. She wore a real fur coat, leather boots that went up to her knees, and thin leather gloves. Her hair was impeccably styled, her makeup perfect, as if she were about to leave for a social event. She watched Sophia work with an expression Edward had never seen before. There was no concern there, no empathy, not the slightest trace of humanity. Just a cold, slight smile at the corners of her mouth, almost satisfied, as if she were watching a private performance staged especially for her entertainment. Every so often, she would take a sip of wine, savoring it slowly without taking her eyes off the child. Next to Veronica, on a small cast-iron table, Edward saw a digital timer. The blood-red numbers marked the time with cruel precision. She was timing her, measuring how long it would take Sophia to complete that impossible task, turning a child's suffering into a cold, quantifiable metric. Something inside Edward broke. It wasn't a gradual process. It was instantaneous, visceral, as if a dam had been shattered all at once. He ran. He ran like he had never run in his life, his feet pounding on the ice, his heart exploding in his chest, his vision blurring with the tears that were beginning to form. He crossed the yard in seconds that felt like hours, each heartbeat echoing in his ears like a war drum. Sophia stumbled at that exact moment. Her feet, likely numb from the extreme cold, failed her. She fell to her knees on the frozen ground, with an impact Edward heard clearly. The trash bag slipped from her injured hands. She let out a cry of pain, a sound that pierced Edward's heart like a sharp blade, twisting in his gut, destroying something fundamental in his soul. It was a cry of physical pain, yes, but also of despair, of absolute exhaustion, of a child who had reached the limit of what she could bear. He reached her in 3 long strides, practically flying over the frozen ground. He dropped to his knees beside her, not feeling the pain of the impact, not feeling the cold seeping through his pants. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her against his chest with an almost desperate force, feeling her thin, trembling body against his. He tore off his own wool coat with frantic movements and covered her small frame, enveloping her completely, trying to transfer all the warmth he could. Sophia slowly lifted her face. Her eyes, those brown eyes that used to sparkle with childish joy, widened as she recognized him. For an instant, a second frozen in time, she seemed not to believe he was really there. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She blinked several times, as if trying to clear an illusion, as if afraid that if she blinked again, he would disappear like a cruel dream. Then reality hit her. He was there. He was real. It wasn't an illusion born of desperation. She broke down, completely. She clung to her father with a strength that belied her apparent fragility, her small injured fingers digging into his shirt, holding on as if her life depended on it. She sobbed uncontrollably, her small body shaking violently with each cry that escaped, waves of repressed emotion finally finding an outlet. These weren't silent tears. They were deep, guttural sobs, coming from somewhere deep inside where the pain had been buried and compacted for too long. "Daddy!" The word came out choked, almost a gasp. "Daddy, you're back. You're really back. You're here. Please don't go away again, please." She repeated the words like a mantra, as if she needed to convince herself that this was really happening. Edward held his daughter tight, feeling the cold radiating from her thin body, the icy hands clinging to his shirt. She was lighter, much lighter than she should be. He pushed the hair back from her face, and that's when he noticed the sunken eyes, the hollow cheeks, the chapped lips. Sophia was malnourished. What happened here? Edward's voice was hoarse, thick with a fury he never knew he was, capable of feeling. He looked at Veronica, who remained seated, impassive as if none of this were out of the ordinary. Discipline, Edward. Just discipline. Her voice was calm, almost bored. The child needed to learn responsibility. You spoiled her. Someone had to correct that. Edward couldn't answer. He couldn't process the words. He lifted Sophia into his arms and walked back into the house, completely ignoring Veronica. He went up the stairs, carried his daughter to his own room, laid her on the bed and covered her with every blanket he could find. Sophia was shivering so hard, her teeth were chattering. He grabbed his phone, called the family's private doctor, and demanded he come immediately. While he waited, Edward sat on the edge of the bed, holding his daughter's small, injured hand. Sophia looked at him with an expression that shattered him. There was fear there, fear of him, as if she expected him to punish her for being found in that state. "Daddy, I tried. I tried to do everything right, but I couldn't. I'm not strong enough." Her voice was a fragile whisper broken by sobs. "You didn't have to do any of this, Sophia. None of it." Edward felt his own tears begin to fall. "Who told you to do this?" "Aunt Veronica. She said you knew, that you agreed, that I needed to learn to be useful, or you wouldn't want me anymore." The words hit Edward like punches. He closed his eyes, trying to control the wave of rage that threatened to consume him. How dare she? How dare she use his name to justify this? "Sophia, listen to me. Look at me." Edward held his daughter's face gently. "I would never, ever want you to go through this. I didn't know anything. Nothing that happened here was your fault. Do you understand? Nothing." Sophia started crying again, but this time it was a different kind of cry, a cry of relief. Edward hugged her, and they stayed like that until the doctor arrived. Dr. Henry Campbell was a serious middle-aged man who had been the Miller family doctor for over a decade. He had been there for Marina's pregnancy, delivered Sophia, and cared for the girl's health all these years. He knew every detail of the family's medical history, which was precisely why his expression grew darker and darker as he examined the child. He worked in silence for long minutes, checking her temperature, blood pressure, and heart rate. He examined her injured hands carefully, cleaning each cut and crack, applying antibiotic ointment. He looked inside Sophia's mouth, checked her teeth, her throat. He asked her to stand, observed her posture, her balance. He asked gentle questions about pain, about when she had last eaten, about how long she had been working in the cold. Sophia's answers were fragmented, hesitant. She would look at Edward before each response, as if asking for permission, as if fearing the consequences. Dr. Campbell noticed this and grew even more concerned. When he finished, he asked to speak with Edward in private. They stepped out into the hallway, leaving Sophia resting on the bed, finally warm, wrapped in blankets, an IV drip slowly feeding into her thin arm. "Edward, this is serious. Very serious." The doctor kept his voice low, but his tone was sharp. "Severe dehydration. She's likely been deprived of adequate water for days. The malnutrition is advanced. She's lost at least 10 pounds since I last saw her 4 months ago. For a child her age, that's extremely dangerous." He paused, gathering his thoughts, choosing his words carefully. "The injuries on her hands aren't new. They're repeated injuries, some starting to heal, others recent. This indicates constant, prolonged physical labor. The frostbite on her ears and cheeks shows repeated exposure to extreme temperatures. The hypothermia I found is moderate, but if she had stayed out in that cold for another half hour, we could be talking about something much more serious, permanent damage, or worse." Edward felt a growing nausea. 10 pounds. Sophia was already naturally slim. Losing 10 pounds meant she was literally being starved. And there's more. Dr. Campbell hesitated, as if deciding whether to continue. "I found signs of intense psychological stress. She's in a state of constant hypervigilance. Did you notice how she looks to you before answering anything? That's the behavior of a child living under constant threat. She's been conditioned to fear the consequences of every word, every action. The doctor placed a hand on Edward's shoulder, his gaze serious and deep. Edward, this wasn't an accident. This child has been subjected to deliberate, systematic, calculated mistreatment. This isn't neglect, it's intentional abuse. As a doctor, I am legally obligated to report this to the proper authorities. Child Protective Services needs to be notified, and depending on their investigation, there could be criminal consequences for whoever did this. I know, Doctor. Edward felt the words come out heavy, laden with guilt. And I'm going to deal with it. But first, I need to understand exactly what happened here. I need all the information before I take the next step. I understand, but don't wait too long. Every day that passes is another day Sophia remains at risk. I'm going to give her medication and leave instructions for her care. She needs to be fed gradually. Her stomach won't tolerate large amounts of food at once. Constant fluids, warmth, rest. And above all, she needs to feel safe emotionally. She needs to know she's protected, that this won't happen again. He prescribed medications, wrote everything down on a prescription pad, and gave detailed instructions on schedules and dosages. He administered a second IV bag, checked Sophia's vitals again, and spoke to her in a soft tone, trying to calm her. Before leaving, he looked at Edward for a long moment. Take care of yourself too. I know you're in shock, but Sophia is going to need you to be strong. And if you need anything, any emergency, call me. I don't care what time it is. After the doctor left, Edward sat beside Sophia's bed, holding her small hand. The girl had finally fallen asleep, physically and emotionally exhausted. Her face, now clean and warm, still showed the marks of her suffering, the deep, dark circles under her eyes, the hollow cheeks, the unnatural pallor. He tried to remember the last time he'd seen his daughter, 3 months ago, and compare her to the child before him now. She was almost unrecognizable. How had he not noticed? This in their brief video calls. How had he let it get to this point? After the doctor left, Edward went downstairs to find Irene Davis, the housekeeper who had worked for the family since before Sophia was born. He found her in the kitchen, sitting on a wooden stool against the wall, her eyes red and swollen, a crumpled tissue in her hands. The 60-year-old woman, always so strong and composed, looked as if she had aged a decade in 3 months. When she saw him, she started to cry. "Mr. Miller." Her voice came out trembling, full of guilt. "I tried. God is my witness, I tried. But she threatened me. She said she'd fire me, that she'd ruin my life, that she'd make sure I never worked anywhere again. I'm old, sir. I have no family, nowhere to go. My social security is barely enough to survive on. I needed this job. But I couldn't stand it. I couldn't stand watching that little girl suffer like that." Edward sat down beside her, placing a hand on her trembling shoulder. The guilt he saw in Irene's eyes was the same guilt he felt burning in his own chest. They were both victims of the same cruel system Veronica had built. "Irene, tell me everything, from the beginning. Every detail, no matter how small it seems. I need to know exactly what happened while I was away." And she told him. In a broken voice, interrupted by sobs, Irene reconstructed the 3 darkest months of Sophia's life. "Everything changed a week after you left for your first trip," Irene began, wiping her eyes with the tissue. "Mrs. Hayes called all the staff into the living room for a meeting. There were 7 of us then. Me, Beatrice, the nanny, Mark the gardener, Carla the cook, Robert the driver, Paula the cleaner, and Julio the security guard. She said she was going to implement new standards of discipline in the house, that Sophia needed to learn responsibility, that we all spoiled the girl too much. Beatrice was the first to be fired. She tried to argue that Sophia was just a child, that she needed affection and care. Mrs. Hayes said she was overstepping her bounds, meddling in family affairs. She fired her on the spot, no notice, no severance. She made sure we all saw it. It was a clear message. Anyone who questioned her would be next." Edward closed his eyes, imagining Beatrice, that kind woman who had cared for Sophia with so much love, being humiliated and thrown out of the house unceremoniously. And what did she do to Sophia after that? Irene took a deep breath, gathering the courage to continue. It started with the meals. Sophia always had breakfast at 7, lunch at noon, a snack at 4, and dinner at 7. Mrs. Hayes changed everything. She said the girl would only eat if she deserved it. She created a list of chores Sophia had to complete to earn each meal. Clean her own room, organize the library, sweep the garage, wash the dishes. Chores that would take hours for an 8-year-old. And if she couldn't finish, then she didn't eat. Tears streamed down Irene's face again. There were days, Mr. Miller. There were days that little girl went the whole day without eating because she couldn't finish everything. I tried to give her food in secret. I managed it once. I gave her a sandwich when Mrs. Hayes went out. But she found out, I don't know how, but she found out. She snatched the plate from my hand and threw it in the trash in front of Sophia. She said the next time I did that, she'd call the police and accuse me of theft. The situation worsened when Carla, the cook, was fired. She felt sorry for Sophia and would always prepare slightly larger portions, hoping there would be leftovers the girl could eat later. Veronica noticed and fired her immediately. She hired a new cook who followed her orders to the letter, preparing exact portions, nothing more than necessary. Mark, the gardener, tried to intervene when he saw Sophia carrying buckets of water that weighed almost as much as she did. He argued that it was dangerous, that the girl could get hurt. He was fired that same week. The new gardener was a quiet man who never questioned anything. One by one, the employees who showed any empathy for Sophia were eliminated. Veronica replaced them with people she hired herself, people who didn't ask questions, who followed orders without hesitation. The atmosphere in the house became claustrophobic, monitored, where any gesture of kindness was treated as betrayal. And there was the phone, Irene continued. Mrs. Hayes confiscated Sophia's cell phone in the first week. She said the girl spent too much time on electronics, but the truth is, she didn't want Sophia to contact you. Every time you called, Mrs. Hayes was the one who answered. She'd make up excuses, say Sophia was busy, tired, that she'd already gone to bed. And when she finally let the girl talk, it was for 2-3 minutes at most. She would stand in the room, listening to every word. Sophia knew it. The girl would look to the side, see Mrs. Hayes watching, and she'd be afraid to say anything wrong. So, she just said everything was fine. She lied because she was afraid of the consequences. Edward remembered the calls. He remembered Sophia's monotone voice, the short answers, the rush to hang up. At the time, he had attributed it to tiredness. Now he understood it was terror. "There's one more thing, sir." Irene took a deep breath, as if what came next was the hardest to say. Mrs. Hayes made that new room for Sophia. That grey room, colourless, lifeless. She called it teaching minimalism and discipline. She took all the toys, all the drawings, all the children's books, and locked them in the basement. She said Sophia could only have access to those things if she behaved perfectly for a whole week. But she created impossible rules to follow. There was always something Sophia did wrong. There was always a reason for the punishment to continue. The girl cried every night. I could hear it from my room. She would cry softly, trying to muffle the sound in her pillow, because she was afraid of being punished, even for crying. One night I couldn't take it. I went up to her room, sat on the edge of her bed, and held her hand until she fell asleep. When I came downstairs, Mrs. Hayes was waiting for me in the hallway. She didn't say a word. She just looked at me. But that look said everything. I was next on the list. Edward felt sick. He felt like an idiot, a negligent father, a man who had been completely fooled. All those calls, all those short video chats where Sophia appeared for just a few seconds, always quiet, always serious. He had attributed the change in her behavior to a phase, to the shyness of her age. He never imagined that behind that screen, his daughter was being systematically destroyed. "Where is she now?" Edward asked, referring to Veronica. "In the office, sir. On the phone. She's always on the phone lately." Edward stood up, his jaw tight. He walked to the ground floor office and opened the door without knocking. Veronica was sitting behind the mahogany desk, the phone to her ear, gesturing as she spoke in a low voice. When she saw him, she ended the call quickly. "Edward, good to have you back. I hope your trip was productive." She spoke as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just found his own daughter being tortured in the backyard. "What did you do to Sophia?" Veronica sighed, as if the question were tedious. "I already explained, Edward. Discipline. The child was spoiled, lazy, with no sense of responsibility. Someone had to educate her properly. You were always traveling, so I took on that responsibility. You were starving her. You put her to work in the cold without proper protection. She's 8 years old, Veronica. 8. And she needs to learn early. The real world isn't kind, Edward. I thought you as a businessman would understand that. Get out of my house now." Veronica rose slowly, smoothing the skirt of her expensive dress. Her expression changed. The smile vanished, replaced by something darker. "My house? Did you forget we have a joint property agreement? Half of this is mine, Edward, and if you try to kick me out, I guarantee you'll regret it. Threats don't work on me." "They're not threats. They're facts." She picked up a folder from the desk and handed it to Edward. "These documents show significant transfers from your accounts, with your signatures, your authorizations. If you try anything against me, I'll claim you're mentally unstable, that you're hallucinating, that you're making up stories about me to justify a divorce that would damage your public image." Edward opened the folder. His blood ran cold. They were financial documents, transfers of millions of dollars to accounts he didn't recognize, and his signature was there. Perfect, identical, masterfully forged. "You never loved me, did you? You never felt anything for Sophia?" "Love is a convenient illusion, Edward. I came here with a goal, and I'm very close to achieving it. You can make things easier by cooperating, or you can make them harder and lose everything, including Sophia. That's impossible. No judge would give you custody after what you've done." Veronica smiled. "What proof do you have? Irene, an employee loyal to you, who would say whatever you told her to? Sophia, a traumatized, easily influenced child who might be repeating what her father told her to say? Meanwhile, I have documents showing you're mentally unstable. I have witnesses who will attest to it, and I have very, very good lawyers." Edward felt the floor disappear from under his feet. She had planned everything, every detail, every move, while he was on the other side of the world believing he was building a better future for his daughter. Veronica was building a perfect trap. "You're not going to get away with this." Veronica walked to the door, stopping beside him. "I already have, Edward. I already have." She left the office, leaving him alone with the forged documents in his hands. Edward spent the night by Sophia's side, who was finally sleeping, exhausted and medicated. He looked at his daughter's face, at the marks of suffering that should never have been there, and made a silent promise, no matter what it cost, no matter how long it took, he would protect his daughter. He would expose Veronica. He would get back everything that had been stolen, and he would make sure nothing like this ever happened again. But as he watched the shadows move across the window, Edward knew the battle was just beginning, and that Veronica was right about one thing. She was very prepared, far ahead of him, and that meant every step he took would have to be calculated with absolute perfection. Outside, the cold of the New York night intensified. Inside the house, another kind of cold was beginning to set in, the cold of the silent war that was about to erupt. The dawn arrived with a heavy silence that foretold a storm. Edward hadn't been able to sleep. He spent the night sitting in an armchair next to Sophia's bed, watching his daughter's uneven breathing, each sigh a painful reminder of what she had endured. Every hour he checked her temperature, adjusted the blankets, and made sure she was comfortable. It was all he could do at that moment. Everything he should have been doing for the past 3 months. The guilt was a physical weight on his shoulders. Every time he looked at Sophia's bandaged hands, every time he noticed how she flinched even in her sleep, Edward felt that weight increase. As a father, his most fundamental job was to protect, and he had failed. Not for lack of love, not for lack of intention, but because of misplaced trust. For believing a lie so well constructed it seemed like the truth. He thought of Marina. He imagined what she would say if she were here, if she could see what their lives had become. Marina had always been intuitive, perceptive. Would she have seen through Veronica's facade? Would she have noticed the signs he had ignored? Probably. Marina had a fierce protective instinct when it came to Sophia. She never would have let that woman get near her daughter. But Marina wasn't here, and Edward had to live with the consequences of his own choices. He couldn't turn back time, couldn't undo the last 2 years. All he could do was fight for the future. Ensure that Sophia never went through something like this again. Ensure that Veronica paid for every moment of suffering she had inflicted. When the first rays of sun began to filter through the curtains, Edward finally stood up. His muscles were tense, his head heavy from lack of sleep, but his mind was surprisingly clear. He had work to do. He needed to understand exactly who he was dealing with, what Veronica's full plan was, and most importantly, how to protect Sophia for good. He went downstairs silently and straight to the office. The folder Veronica had left the night before was still on the mahogany desk. Edward opened it again, this time examining each document with meticulous attention. They were bank transfers totaling $8 million, spread out over the last 2 months. Accounts in Panama, the Cayman Islands, Dubai, all with his perfectly forged signature. He picked up his cell phone and called Michael Taylor, his personal lawyer and longtime friend. The man answered on the 3rd ring, his voice still sleepy. "Michael, I need you here, now. It's urgent." "Edward? It's 5:30 in the morning. What happened?" "I can't talk over the phone. Come to my house. Bring everything you have on marriage contracts, corporate documents, and an expert in document fraud. And Michael, be discreet. I don't want anyone to know you're coming." There was a pause. Michael had known Edward for 15 years, since the early days of the company. He knew how to recognize when something was seriously wrong. "I'll be there in 40 minutes. Edward hung up and turned his attention to the computer. He needed to find out who Veronica Hayes really was. He started with social media. Her profile was impeccable, professionally curated. Photos at cultural events, international trips, charity dinners. All very polished, very perfect. Too perfect. That's when he noticed something strange. All the photos were less than 3 years old. There were no earlier records, no teenage pictures, no college. Records, no visible family history. It was as if Veronica Hayes had simply materialized in the world 3 years ago, fully formed, with no past. Edward expanded his search. He looked for her name on company websites, professional registries, anything that might reveal more. He found a consulting firm registered in her name, but the opening date was recent, just 6 months before they met. Before that, nothing. Absolutely nothing. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made him look up. Veronica was at the door, impeccably dressed despite the hour, holding a cup of coffee. The smile on her lips didn't reach her cold eyes. "Up early, Edward. Couldn't sleep thinking about our conversation last night. Who are you really, Veronica?" She walked into the office with measured steps, sat in the chair across from the desk, and crossed her legs elegantly. "I'm your wife, Sophia's adoptive mother, the owner of half of everything you possess. Do you need more details?" Veronica Hayes didn't exist before 3 years ago. No real professional history, no visible family, no verifiable past. You built an identity from scratch. The question is, why? Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second, so quickly that someone less attentive wouldn't have noticed. But Edward saw it. He saw the mask slip briefly before being put back in place. "You're being paranoid, Edward. The stress from your trips, the shock from yesterday, it's making you imagine conspiracies where there are none. $8 million were transferred from my accounts in the last 2 months, with forged signatures. That's not paranoia, Veronica. It's a crime." She stood up slowly, placing the cup on the desk with deliberate care. "Proving the signatures are forgeries will be difficult. Proving I forged them will be impossible. Meanwhile, I have documents showing you're mentally unstable. I have witnesses who will confirm your erratic behavior, and I have Sophia, who can be easily convinced that her father is confused, sick, even dangerous. You will not touch her again. I don't need to. I've already done what I needed to do." Veronica walked to the door, pausing in the doorway. "Oh, and Edward, my brother arrives today. Ryan is eager to get to know the family business better. After all, it's important for him to understand the company he'll soon be vice president of." Your brother is not setting foot in my company. Veronica laughed, a humorless sound. Your company? You mean our company. And you'll find that Ryan already has access to a lot of things. Documents signed by you, authorizing his entry onto the board of directors. It must have been that day you signed so many papers before your trip. Remember, you were in such a hurry. Edward felt his blood run cold. She was right. Before his last trip, he had signed dozens of documents his assistant had brought him. Contracts, authorizations, powers of attorney. He was late for his flight and signed everything quickly, trusting it was all in order. That's when she had inserted the fraudulent documents. Veronica left the office, leaving Edward alone with the magnitude of what he was facing. She hadn't acted on impulse. Every move had been calculated, every document prepared in advance. She had been playing this game for much longer than he had imagined. 40 minutes later, Michael Taylor arrived, accompanied by a woman in her 40s with short brown hair, thin-framed glasses, and carrying a worn leather briefcase that spoke of years of professional use. She wore a discreet but elegant navy blue suit, and there was a determination in her eyes that immediately conveyed confidence. Edward, this is Dr. Julia Morris, a specialist in document fraud and family law. She handles some of the most complex cases in New York. She's resolved situations that seemed impossible. Julia extended her hand, her grip firm and professional. Mr. Miller, Michael told me a few things on the way, but I need to hear everything directly from you. Every detail matters. Things that might seem insignificant are often the missing piece to the puzzle. The three settled in the office. Edward closed the door carefully, and for the first time since it all began, told the complete story to someone other than Irene. He started at the beginning, at the gala at the Met, where he met Veronica, the whirlwind romance, the wedding. He described how she gradually took control of the house, replacing staff, isolating Sophia. He talked about the increasingly long trips, the monitored calls, the signs he had ignored. When he got to the part about finding Sophia in the backyard, his voice broke. He had to pause, take a deep breath, and gather his strength to continue. Julia waited patiently, not pressuring him, giving him the time he needed. Edward showed them the forged documents, recounted Veronica's threats, and described the cruel system of punishment and reward that had been implemented. He told them about his conversation with Irene, about how employees were systematically eliminated. He mentioned Dr. Campbell's examination, the documented injuries, the severe malnutrition. Julia listened in absolute silence, taking quick notes on a tablet with a stylus. Her eyes narrowed at certain points in the narrative, her jaw tensed at others. When Edward finished, it was past 7 in the morning. He felt exhausted, as if he had run an emotional marathon. Julia placed the tablet on the desk and steepled her fingers, looking directly at Edward with an expression that mixed compassion and professional determination. Mr. Miller, what you're describing is an extremely sophisticated con. This isn't the first time I've seen it. There are groups, actual criminal organizations, that specialize in identifying wealthy men, usually widowers or divorcees with children, and running long-term schemes. The pattern is always similar. Strategic approach, gaining trust, a quick marriage, access to assets, document forgery, isolating the victim, and eventually a complete takeover of the fortune. She paused, letting the information sink in. They usually work in pairs or small groups. The woman is the bait and the one who executes the marriage. The partner, often introduced as a brother or close relative, assists with the financial and corporate side. They study the victim for months before the initial approach. They know your tastes, your habits, your vulnerabilities. When they finally introduce themselves, they seem like the perfect person, because they have literally molded their persona for it. But how do they forge documents so well? Michael asked. The signatures are perfect. I've been looking at Edward's signature for years, and I couldn't tell the fakes from the real ones. Julia opened her briefcase and took out some documents from previous cases. They have access to experts, corrupt graphologists, professional forgers. They collect samples of the real signatures over time. Every document Edward signed in front of Veronica was potentially photographed, studied, and reproduced. With modern technology and enough practice, It's possible to create forgeries that are almost indistinguishable from the original. She ran her fingers over the documents on the desk. What makes this case particularly egregious is the element of child abuse. Most of these cons focus only on the financial aspect. But using a child as an instrument of control and psychological torture elevates this to a whole other level. It's pure psychopathy. Edward felt sick. He had been a perfect victim, a widower, vulnerable, with a young daughter, desperate to rebuild a family. What can I do? Julia opened her briefcase and took out some documents. First, we need to verify these signatures. I have contacts with forensic document examiners who can perform a full analysis. Second, we need to investigate Veronica Hayes' true identity. Third, and most importantly, we need to protect Sophia. If Veronica has a way to prove you're mentally unstable, she could get a temporary restraining order against you. Michael intervened, his expression grave. Edward, you need to understand the legal situation. You're married with a joint property agreement. That means, legally, she's entitled to half of everything. Even if we prove the signatures are forgeries, the process will be long. And during that process, she can use the child as a bargaining chip. Then I'll take Sophia and leave the country. That would be international kidnapping, Edward. You'd lose everything, including any chance of legally reversing the situation. Julia placed her hand on the desk, drawing both their attention. There's another option, a riskier one, but it could work. We need to gather solid evidence of the abuse against Sophia. We need to demonstrate that Veronica poses a real and immediate danger to the child. With that, we can get an emergency protective order, removing her from the house and from Sophia. Simultaneously, we'll initiate a criminal investigation into the financial fraud. What if she uses the documents she has against me before we can do that? That's why we need to act fast, today. I'm bringing in an independent medical team to examine Sophia again, to document everything. I'll call social workers. I'll take depositions from Irene and any other employee who witnessed the abuse. I'll photograph the modified room, collect physical evidence. In 48 hours, we'll have a complete dossier. And what about her brother? Edward asked. Veronica said he's arriving today, that he already has access to the company. Michael and Julia exchanged worried glances. We need to verify that immediately. Michael picked up his phone. I'm calling the company's legal department, asking them to review all documents from the last 6 months. If he really has access to the board, this is serious. While Michael made his calls, Julia continued to lay out the plan of action. They needed speed and precision. One wrong move, and Veronica could disappear with millions, or worse, succeed in permanently separating Edward from Sophia. Around 8 in the morning, Sophia woke up. Edward ran upstairs to find her sitting up in bed, her eyes still swollen but a little clearer than the night before. She saw him and smiled shyly, a fragile smile that broke his heart. Good morning, Princess. How are you feeling? Better, Daddy. It still hurts a little, but better. Edward sat beside her, taking her hand carefully. Sophia, I need to ask you some questions. I know it's hard, but it's very important. Can you tell me everything that happened while I was away? From the beginning? Sophia looked down, her fingers nervously playing with the edge of the blanket. Aunt Veronica will be mad. She's not going to do anything to you, I promise. But I need to know the truth. Everything, Sophia, no matter how much it hurts to tell. And she told him. In a low voice, punctuated by pauses and tears, Sophia described the 3-month nightmare. It started with the firing of Beatrice, the person who made her feel safe. Then came the rules. Wake up at 5 in the morning, make her own bed with military precision, clean the entire room before breakfast. If anything was out of place, she didn't eat. The chores escalated. Organizing the library, cleaning the bathroom, sweeping the garage, washing the dishes, raking leaves in the yard. Some tasks were impossible for an 8-year-old to complete in the allotted time, and when she didn't complete them, she was punished. No food, isolation in her room, extra work in the cold. There was one specific day, Sophia recounted in a trembling voice, when the temperature dropped sharply. It was snowing, a rare occurrence in the city. Veronica sent her outside without a coat to collect all the week's trash. She was out there for hours. Her hands got so cold she couldn't feel her fingers anymore. When she finally finished and came back inside, Veronica said she had taken too long, so she didn't deserve dinner. Edward listened with tears streaming silently down his face. Every word was a stab. How had he let this happen? How had he not seen it? "And the phone?" Edward asked. "Did you try to call me?" "She took my cell phone on the second day. She said I spent too much time on screens, that it wasn't healthy. But the truth is, she didn't want me to talk to you. When you called, she only let me talk if I promised not to tell you anything. She said if I told, you'd be disappointed in me, that you'd send me away just like you sent Aunt Beatrice away. I would never, ever do that, Sophia. Never." Edward pulled her into a careful hug. "None of this is your fault. None of it." There was a knock on the door. It was Julia, accompanied by a man in a white coat, about 50, with greying hair, round glasses, and a kind expression. Beside him was a young woman with a professional camera hanging from her neck and a bag full of equipment. "Mr. Miller, this is Dr. Paul Mendez, a pediatrician specializing in child abuse cases. He works with Mount Sinai Hospital and is an expert witness in many court cases. And this is Christina Rocha, a certified forensic photographer. She will visually document everything the doctor finds." Edward explained to Sophia what was going to happen, crouching by the bed to be at her eye level. "Princess, these people are going to examine you and take some pictures. I know it seems strange, but it's important. It's going to help us make sure you're safe. I'll be right here the whole time, right by your side, okay?" Sophia looked at the doctor and photographer with apprehension, but nodded slowly. The trust she placed in her father was absolute, even after everything. Dr. Paul approached carefully, moving slowly, keeping his voice soft and reassuring. "Hi, Sophia. You can call me Dr. Paul. I'm going to examine you just like the doctor who came last night, but I'm going to look a little more closely. If anything hurts or bothers you, you let me know right away, okay?" He started with the basics: temperature, blood pressure, listening to her heart and lungs. Then he moved on to the more detailed examination. He examined every wound on her hands with a magnifying glass and a special light, measuring depth, estimating healing time. The cracks were consistent with prolonged exposure to extreme cold combined with heavy manual labor. Some showed signs of early infection. The frostbite on her ears and cheeks was second degree in some spots. Dr. Paul explained as he took notes that these injuries indicated exposure of at least 3 to 4 hours in near-freezing temperatures. For a child without proper protection, this bordered on criminal. Christina photographed everything with professional precision. Each injury was captured from multiple angles, with a ruler alongside for scale under different types of lighting. She worked in silence, but Edward could see the tension in her face. Even for someone used to this kind of work, documenting a child's suffering never got easy. The weight and height examination revealed alarming data. Sophia had lost 10 pounds and an inch since her last checkup 4 months ago. An inch. Children don't shrink. That was only possible with malnutrition, so severe it affected bone and muscle development. Her weight placed her below the 3rd percentile for her age. Technically, she was in a state of starvation. Dr. Paul asked to see Sophia's mouth again. He examined her teeth, noting signs of calcium deficiency. Her gums were pale, indicating possible anemia. He asked her to stand and observed her posture. Her stooped shoulders weren't just from fatigue. It was the posture of someone who had spent too much time carrying excessive weight. "Mr. Miller, can I speak with you outside for a moment?" Dr. Paul asked when he finished the exam. They stepped out into the hallway. The doctor partially closed the door and spoke in a low but firm voice. "The situation is worse than it appears at first glance. Besides the obvious malnutrition and physical injuries, I found signs of chronic stress that have affected her development. The loss of height, which is extremely rare in healthy children, indicates her body was in survival mode, halting growth to conserve energy. This only happens in cases of extreme and prolonged deprivation." He consulted his notes on his tablet. "The injuries show a pattern. They are not isolated accidents. They are repeated lesions, consistent with forced manual labor over weeks or months. The marks on her knees suggest she spent a lot of time kneeling on hard surfaces. The calluses on her palms are typical of carrying excessive weight, and the signs of repeated hypothermia indicate frequent exposure to cold. Edward felt nausea rising, and psychologically. Dr. Paul sighed heavily. That is perhaps the most concerning part. Sophia exhibits all the classic signs of complex psychological trauma. The hypervigilance, the need for approval before every answer, the fear of consequences for normal things. This doesn't develop overnight. It's the result of systematic conditioning through punishment and reward. Behaviorism applied cruelly. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Mr. Miller, in 20 years of my career, I've handled hundreds of child abuse cases. Neglect, physical violence, horrific situations. But what was done to Sophia is particularly insidious because it was calculated. It wasn't an explosion of anger. It wasn't neglect due to incompetence. It was deliberate psychological torture, applied systematically with the specific goal of breaking a child's spirit. It's one of the most disturbing cases I've ever seen. Meanwhile, Julia and her team were photographing the modified room, collecting the toys that had been stored in the basement, and interviewing Irene. Every statement was recorded, every piece of evidence meticulously catalogued. Around noon, Michael returned from the office with grave news. Ryan Hayes was indeed listed as a member of the board of directors of Miller Solutions. The documents appeared legitimate, bearing Edward's signature, dated 2 months ago. More worryingly, significant transfers had been authorized to accounts linked to him. How much? Edward asked, already anticipating the answer. 12 million, distributed in non-existent investments, shell consulting firms, and fraudulent acquisitions. 20 million in total, then. Edward sat down heavily. They were robbing the company from the inside while I was building new business on the outside. And there's more, Michael hesitated. I found records of communication between Ryan and some of our key investors. He's spreading rumors about your mental health, suggesting you need to step away from the company temporarily. Some investors are already expressing concern. Edward closed his eyes. It was a multi-front attack. Financial, emotional, reputational. Veronica and Ryan had thought of everything. We need to act now, Julia said firmly. I have enough evidence for an emergency protective order. I'm going to the courthouse today to file everything. But Edward, you need to be prepared. When we do this, Veronica will react, and it could get ugly, legally speaking. She will use every weapon she has. I don't care. Protecting Sophia is all that matters. Julia nodded and left with her team, taking all the collected material. Michael stayed a bit longer, discussing legal strategies, possible scenarios, and contingency plans. When he finally left, it was past 3 in the afternoon. Edward went back upstairs to be with Sophia. He found her drawing sitting on the bed, using colored pencils Irene had found in the basement. The drawing showed a house with 2 figures, one large and one small, holding hands under a bright yellow sun. Is that us? Edward asked softly. Sophia nodded, not taking her eyes off the paper. Daddy, are we going to be okay? We are, Princess. I promise. But it was a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. As he watched Sophia color the sky blue, Edward knew the battle was just beginning, and that Veronica, downstairs, was probably already planning her next move. The afternoon passed quietly, a deceptive calm. Edward prepared a light snack for Sophia, helped her take a bath, and changed the dressings on her hands. Irene came in a few times, bringing tea, cookies, and checking if they needed anything. The house felt almost normal, almost peaceful. It was when the sun began to set that things changed. The sound of an approaching car caught Edward's attention. He looked out the window and saw a black BMW pull into the driveway. Man got out of the car, tall, dark hair, slicked back, expensive suit, arrogant posture. Ryan Hayes. Veronica went out to greet him. They kissed each other on the cheek and spoke briefly before entering the house. Edward went downstairs silently, stopping in the hallway where he could hear their conversation without being seen. Is everything going according to plan? Ryan's voice was deep, confident. Better than we expected, Veronica replied, an audible smile in her voice. He's found out a few things, but it's too late. The documents are in order, the money is secure, and we have witnesses ready to testify about his mental state. And the kid. An unexpected bonus. We can use her as leverage if needed. But honestly, Ryan, I don't think we'll even have to. He'll cave. Men like him always do when their children are involved. Edward felt rage boiling in his veins. They spoke of Sophia as if she were an object, a bargaining chip. How long until we have full control of the company? Ryan asked. A month, maybe less. I've already spread the right rumors, planted the necessary doubts. The board will ask for his voluntary leave of absence, and when that happens, you'll take over as interim CEO. And then? Then we sell everything. We break up the company, sell the assets, transfer the money, and disappear. 50 million, Ryan. Maybe more. All clean, all legal, with documents signed by Edward Miller himself. They laughed. A cold, calculated sound, devoid of any trace of humanity. Edward returned silently to Sophia's room. He needed to think, to plan. Julia said she would file the documents today, but the legal process would take time. Time he might not have. Veronica and Ryan were moving their pieces quickly, and with every passing hour, he was losing more ground. That night, after making sure Sophia was sound asleep, Edward did something he never imagined he would do. He began to plan an escape, not as a criminal, not as a kidnapper, but as a desperate father protecting his daughter in the only way he saw possible. He had a property in the Berkshires, a farm he had bought years ago under a holding company Veronica didn't know about. It was isolated, hard to reach, perfect for hiding out temporarily while Julia worked on the legal proceedings. He called Irene and explained the plan. The woman didn't hesitate. I'll go with you, Mr. Miller. The girl needs me, and I'm not staying another day in this house knowing what I know. They arranged to leave the next morning before dawn. Edward would pack a discreet bag for Sophia, essential documents, cash. They would use Irene's car, less conspicuous than any of his own vehicles. But as he made these plans, a part of Edward knew he was crossing a dangerous line. He knew Veronica would use this against him, that she would paint it as kidnapping, as evidence of the mental instability she had been constructing. But looking at Sophia sleeping, small and fragile under the blankets, he saw no other choice. Sometimes, he thought, protecting the ones we love means making impossible choices. It means risking everything, including your own freedom, to ensure their safety. And Edward was ready to take that risk. Outside, the New York night followed its normal course. Cars passed on the quiet Greenwich Street, lights turned on and off in the neighboring mansions. The world kept spinning, oblivious to the drama unfolding inside that particular house. But for Edward, this would be the last night before everything changed. Before, he became, in the eyes of the law, a fugitive. Before he sacrificed everything he had built to save the only thing that truly mattered. The war had been declared, and tomorrow, with the first ray of sunlight, he would take the first step on a path of no return. Wednesday morning arrived shrouded in fog. Edward woke Sophia at 5 a.m., whispering softly so as not to startle her. The girl opened her eyes slowly, still sleepy, but immediately alert upon seeing her father's serious expression. "Princess, I need you to trust me. We're going to leave the house. For a few days, just you, me, and Irene. But it has to be now, and it has to be quiet. Can you do that?" Sophia nodded, her eyes wide but trusting. Edward helped her dress in warm clothes and comfortable sneakers. He put a few toys in her backpack, the teddy bear she loved, and enough clothes for a week. Irene appeared at the door, already ready, carrying a bag with groceries and medicine. "The car is in the back garage, Mr. Miller. I filled it up last night while she was on the phone." The three of them went down the stairs carefully, avoiding the steps that creaked. The house was silent. Veronica was still asleep in the master bedroom. Edward felt a pang of hesitation. Was he really doing this? Fleeing his own home like a criminal? But then he looked at Sophia, at her still bandaged hands, and the hesitation vanished. They crossed the kitchen, went out the back door, and reached the garage where Irene's old sedan was waiting. Edward settled Sophia in the back seat, covered her with a blanket, and put the bags in the trunk. Irene took the wheel. She knew alternate routes, less monitored roads. The back garage door opened silently. Edward had deactivated the alarm a few minutes earlier. The car slid out onto the empty street, its headlights still off. Only when they were 2 blocks away did Irene turn on the lights. Edward looked back at the mansion disappearing into the morning fog. Part of him knew he would never return to that place in the same way, that by crossing that gate, he was also crossing a line that would change everything. But there was no regret, only determination. The drive to the Berkshires would take about 3 hours. Edward had turned off all their cell phones and removed the batteries. He knew Veronica would try to track them as soon as she discovered they were gone. He had bought burner phones the day before, numbers no one knew. He called Julia from one of them. "Dr. Morris, we did what we discussed. We're on our way to the safe location." Her voice came through, tense. "Edward, this complicates things legally. Veronica can use this to claim parental kidnapping." "I know. But I couldn't leave Sophia in that house for another day. Not after what I found out yesterday." He told her about the conversation he had overheard between Veronica and Ryan, about their plan to sell the company, about how they spoke of Sophia as a bargaining chip. "I understand," Julia sighed. "I'm filing the protective order request today, arguing that you removed the child from a situation of imminent danger. But Edward, you need to come back as soon as I get the court order. If you stay away too long, I won't be able to defend it as emergency protection." "How long?" 48 hours, max. I'm going to move heaven and earth to get an emergency hearing." Edward hung up and put the phone away. Sophia had fallen asleep again in the back seat, lulled by the car's motion. Irene drove steadily, her hands firm on the wheel, her eyes fixed on the road. Every so often she would glance in the rearview mirror, checking if they were being followed. As the city gave way to the countryside, Edward allowed himself a moment of reflection. How had his life come to this? 2 years ago, he was rebuilding happiness, believing he had found a second chance. Now he was on the run like a criminal, his company being looted, his daughter traumatized, everything crumbling around him. But there was something Veronica didn't understand, something no amount of money could buy. Edward loved Sophia more than he loved his own life, more than his company, his reputation, his freedom. And when you love like that, there is no price too high to pay for that love's protection. They arrived at the farm around 8 in the morning. It was a modest but well-kept property, hidden among mountains covered in forest. The main house was made of stone, rustic, with wide porches and a view of a green valley. There was a caretaker, Mrs. Maria, who looked after the place and had known Edward since he bought the property 5 years ago. "Mr. Miller, what a nice surprise!" The 60-year-old woman opened her arms for a warm hug. "And this little princess must be Sophia. I've heard so much about you, dear." Sophia smiled shyly, still holding her father's hand. Mrs. Maria prepared fresh coffee, warm muffins, and freshly squeezed orange juice. The kitchen smelled of firewood and home cooking, a stark contrast to the impersonal coldness of the mansion in Greenwich. While Sophia ate slowly, relearning what it was like to have a normal appetite, Edward spoke with Mrs. Maria in private, explaining the situation without going into too much detail. The woman was discreet, trustworthy. She agreed to help in any way necessary. The first 2 days at the farm were filled with a tense tranquility. Sophia gradually began to relax. She played with the property's dogs, helped Mrs. Maria feed the chickens, and sat on the porch drawing while looking at the mountains. For the first time in months, she seemed like a normal child doing normal childhood things. Edward spent the afternoons with her, making up for lost time. They read together, talked, or simply existed in the same space without pressure or fear. At night, after Sophia was asleep, he would call Julia for updates. The situation in New York was, predictably, explosive. "Veronica filed a police report as soon as she found out you were gone," Julia reported, her voice heavy with concern. "She's claiming parental kidnapping, mental instability, risk to the child. The press has already picked up the story. Your company is at the center of a scandal. And the protective order? I got a hearing for tomorrow at 9 a.m. The judge is known for being thorough but fair. I've submitted the entire medical dossier, the depositions, the photographs. But Edward, Veronica has also submitted documents, psychiatric reports claiming you suffer from psychotic breaks, that you have a history of erratic behavior. They're obviously fake, but they're well made. How could she get fake reports so quickly? Because they were prepared beforehand. She already had everything ready, just waiting for the right moment to use it. This only confirms how calculated the entire con was. Edward felt a chill. Veronica had planned for every contingency, every possible reaction from him. It was like playing chess against someone who could see 10 moves ahead. On the morning of the third day, when Edward woke up, something felt different. There was a tension in the air he couldn't identify. He went down to the kitchen and found Mrs. Maria pale, holding a phone. "Mr. Miller, someone called here, a woman, asking if you were here. I said no, but she insisted. She said she knew you were here, that it would be better for me to cooperate." "How did she get this number?" Mrs. Maria shook her head, confused. "I don't know, Mr. Miller. This is an old landline. Almost no one has the number. Just family, a few neighbors." Edward felt the danger closing in. Veronica was hunting them, using resources he hadn't imagined she had. He immediately called Julia. "They know where we are. We need to get out of here." "Calm down, Edward. The hearing is in 3 hours. I'm on my way to the courthouse now. Hold on until I have the protective order in hand. With it, you can legally return with Sophia." "What if there isn't time?" Julia hesitated before answering. "Then you could be in serious trouble. Parental kidnapping with the aggravating factor of fleeing is a serious crime. I can mitigate it, argue you are acting in the child's best interest, but I can't guarantee anything." Edward hung up, his heart racing. He ran up to Sophia's room and found her already awake, sitting on the bed, hugging her teddy bear. "Daddy, is something wrong?" He tried to smile to reassure her, but Sophia knew him too well. "Just a little snag, Princess, but everything's going to be okay." Then they heard it, the unmistakable sound of cars coming up the dirt road. Not one car, several. Edward ran to the window and saw 3 vehicles approaching at high speed. The first was Ryan's BMW. The second was a black SUV he didn't recognize. The third looked official, maybe police. "Edward, what do we do?" Irene appeared at the door, panic evident in her voice. He thought quickly. Running again wasn't an option, not with Sophia in a fragile state, not with the police possibly involved. He had to face them, but on his own terms. "Irene, take Sophia to the back room, lock the door, don't open it for anyone but me. Mrs. Maria, stay with them. I'm going down to handle this." "But Mr. Miller, trust me, everything will be fine." Edward went down the stairs, his heart pounding but his mind surprisingly clear. He opened the front door seconds before Veronica knocked. She was there, elegant even in this absurd situation, accompanied by Ryan and 2 men who looked like private security. Behind them, 2 state troopers were getting out of their cruiser. "Edward," her voice was cold, controlled. "Did you really think you could run, that I wouldn't find you? I came to protect my daughter, unlike you who used her as an instrument of torture." One of the troopers stepped forward holding a document. "Mr. Edward Miller, we have a court order to recover a minor child. The child, Sophia Miller, must be handed over immediately to her legal mother, Mrs. Veronica Hayes Miller. She is not her mother. She's a con artist who married me to steal my company." The trooper looked uncomfortably between Edward and Veronica. "Sir, regardless of the allegations, we have a court order. Where is the girl?" It was at that moment that Edward's phone rang. It was Julia. He answered without taking, his eyes off Veronica. "Edward, I got it. The judge just signed the emergency protective order removing Veronica from Sophia's custody. A court officer is on their way there with the order now. Hold them off for 5 more minutes." Edward put the phone on speaker for everyone to hear. "Dr. Morris, there are state troopers here with a recovery order." "That order predates the one that was just signed. The new order takes precedence because it's specific to the protection of a minor in a high-risk situation. The officers can verify it in the system. The case number is—" She read out the number. One of the troopers consulted the tablet he was carrying, checking the judicial system in real time. His expression changed. "It's confirmed. There's an emergency protective order, signed 15 minutes ago by Judge Marcia Fernandez of Family Court Part 2. It orders the immediate removal of Mrs. Veronica Hayes from contact with the minor Sophia Miller on the grounds of risk of physical and psychological harm, based on medical reports and photographic evidence submitted to the court. The trooper looked at Veronica with an expression that mixed surprise and disapproval. "Ma'am, you need to leave the premises immediately. Any attempt to contact the minor will constitute a violation of a court order." Veronica turned pale. For the first time, Edward saw the mask slip completely. There was rage there, pure, unfiltered rage. "This isn't over, Edward. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I will destroy you. Your company, your reputation, your life. When I'm done, you'll have nothing. I no longer have anything material that matters more to me than Sophia, and she is the one thing you will never take from me." Ryan tried to intervene, but the troopers were already escorting them back to their vehicles. In a few minutes, the cars were heading back down the mountain, leaving only dust in the air. Edward felt his legs grow weak. He sat down on the porch steps, the adrenaline finally giving way to exhaustion. Minutes later, another car arrived. It was the court officer with the printed and stamped order. Everything was, finally, officially documented. Sophia appeared at the door, Irene and Mrs. Maria right behind her. The girl ran into her father's arms, and the two of them held each other there on the porch under the Berkshire sun, as the world around them slowly began to make sense again. The following days were a whirlwind of legal proceedings. Edward and Sophia returned to New York, but not to the mansion in Greenwich. Julia had arranged for a secure apartment while everything was sorted out. The protective order was made permanent after a hearing where Sophia was interviewed by a court-appointed psychologist and a social worker. The girl's testimony, recorded in a protected chamber appropriate for children, was devastating. She described details no 8-year-old should be able to describe. The impossible chores, the constant hunger, the biting cold, the fear that haunted her every moment. The court psychologist reported clear signs of complex trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, and systematic abuse. Meanwhile, the financial investigation revealed deeper and deeper layers of fraud. It wasn't just $20 million. It was $35 million siphoned off through shell companies, fake investments, and fraudulent contracts. Ryan Hayes wasn't really Veronica's brother. They were criminal partners who had run the same scam on at least 4 other victims over the past 10 years. Veronica Hayes wasn't even her real name. It was Vera Santos, born in Miami, with a criminal record that included grand larceny, identity theft, and racketeering. She had changed her identity 3 times. She had a playbook, literally a text document found on her computer, detailing how to identify victims, how to gain their trust, and how to execute the con step by step. The police found documents at Ryan's house about other potential victims they were already studying. Wealthy, vulnerable men with children. The pattern was always the same. Strategic approach, quick marriage, access to assets, financial drain and disappearance before they were discovered. Edward was the latest victim, but he was also the first to fight back hard enough to expose the entire scheme. The criminal case moved surprisingly quickly. The evidence was overwhelming. Forged documents, surveillance videos showing Veronica and Ryan in suspicious meetings, employee testimonies, complete bank records. In 3 months, both were convicted. Veronica Santos Hayes got 12 years for aggravated fraud, forgery, child abuse, and racketeering. Ryan got 10 years for the same charges, minus the direct abuse against Sophia. The company took longer to recover. Some of the funds were recovered, but a large portion had been dissipated into international accounts that were difficult to trace. Edward lost approximately 40% of his net worth. But surprisingly, he didn't care as much as he thought he would. Sophia was what mattered, and Sophia was beginning to recover. Therapy was long and painful. Twice a week, religiously, she visited a psychologist, Dr. Helena Roberts, a specialist in childhood trauma. The first sessions were difficult. Sophia had nightmares, woke up screaming. She was afraid to eat, as if still expecting to be punished. She was afraid of making mistakes, of disappointing, of being abandoned. But gradually, week by week, month by month, Sophia began to understand that she was safe, that Daddy wasn't going away. Again, that food wasn't a conditional reward. That being a child meant being able to play, make mistakes, and exist without fear. Edward was there for every step of her recovery. He drastically reduced his work travel. He promoted trusted executives to take on more responsibilities. He implemented a remote work system that allowed him to be present, because he had realized, in the most painful way possible, that no amount of professional success was worth being absent from his daughter's life. A year after it all began, on a winter morning that wasn't as cold as that first one, Edward woke up to Sophia jumping on his bed. "Daddy, Daddy, Dr. Helena said I can stop therapy. She said I'm so much better that I only have to go once a month now." Edward hugged his daughter, feeling tears of relief burn his eyes. "I'm so proud of you, Princess, so proud of the strong girl you are." Later that day, while they were having hot chocolate in the kitchen of their new apartment, smaller and cozier than the cold mansion in Greenwich, Sophia asked a question Edward had been expecting for months. "Daddy, why did Aunt Veronica do those things to me?" It was the hardest question. How do you explain cruelty to a child? How do you make sense of the senseless? You know, Sophia, sometimes there are people in the world who are hurt on the inside in a way we can't see. And those people, instead of getting help to heal, end up hurting others. It's not the fault of the people they hurt. It's not your fault. It never was. She was sick in a way that made her do terrible things. He held his daughter's hands, now almost completely healed. "But you know, what's most important? You survived. You are stronger than you can imagine. And now we're here together, and no one is ever going to hurt you like that again. I promise." Sophia nodded, thoughtful. "Daddy, at school, the teacher asked us to write about what we want to be when we grow up. Can I write that I want to help kids who have been through bad things like I did?" Edward felt his heart ache and swell at the same time. "Yes, you can, Princess. I think that would be amazing." And that's what Sophia did. She wrote a simple but powerful essay about how she wanted to be a psychologist when she grew up, to help other children not be afraid. Her teacher was so touched that she asked for permission to share it with the school administration. Sophia's story, told in an age-appropriate way, became part of an educational project on resilience and overcoming adversity. Edward, inspired by his daughter's strength, made a decision. He would use part of his remaining fortune to create an institution, not a typical foundation but a specialized center for child victims of abuse in complex family situations. A place where they would receive not only shelter and food, but intensive therapy, quality education, and most importantly, the understanding that what happened to them does not define who they are. The Sophia Center, as it was named, opened its doors 18 months after that first terrible night. It was a large house in a quiet New York neighborhood, with colorful rooms, a playroom, a library, a garden with swings, and a staff of specially trained psychologists, social workers, and educators. Sophia, now 10, visited the center regularly. She talked to other children, shared her story when she felt comfortable, and offered a kind of hope that only someone who has been through the fire can offer. She showed with her simple presence that it is possible to survive, that it is possible to heal, that it is possible to be happy again. One spring afternoon, 2 years after it all began, Edward was in the center's garden watching Sophia play with a group of newly arrived children. She was laughing, running, being gentle and patient with a 6-year-old girl who was afraid of everything. He saw in his daughter a maturity that shouldn't exist in someone so young, but he also saw a genuine joy he had feared was lost forever. "Mr. Miller." It was Helena, Sophia's psychologist, who now also coordinated the center. She was watching the same scene. She's special, you know, not because of what happened to her, but because of what she chose to do with it. Many children who go through trauma like this either shut down or repeat negative patterns. Sophia chose to turn pain into empathy. That's rare. "She's stronger than I am," Edward admitted. "I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, thinking about what I could have done differently, how I didn't see the signs, how I was so blind." Helena placed a hand on his shoulder. "You were manipulated by professional manipulators. It wasn't naivete or neglect. It was a calculated con, executed by people without a conscience. And when you found out, you didn't hesitate. You risked everything to protect her. That's what she'll remember. Not the months you were away, but the moment you chose to be present, no matter the cost. Edward nodded, the words bringing a comfort he didn't know he needed. That night, as he was putting Sophia to bed in the apartment they now called home, she did something she hadn't done in a long time. She asked him to tell her a story. What kind of story, Princess? A story with a happy ending, where everyone who is good is okay in the end. Edward thought for a moment, then began. Once upon a time there was a very brave princess who went through a very cold winter. She was scared, she was sad, but she never gave up. She had a king who loved this princess more than anything in the world, but who sometimes got lost in the work of ruling the kingdom. One day a wicked witch came to the castle and did terrible things, but do you know what happened? What? The king and the princess joined together, they fought together, and in the end they cast out the witch, reclaimed their castle, and learned that the most important treasure wasn't gold or jewels, but being together. And they lived, not necessarily forever, because life always has challenges, but they lived happily in the moments that mattered. And the princess grew up to be a great healer who helped many other people. Sophia smiled, her eyes already heavy with sleep. That story sounds like us, Daddy. It does, Princess, it really does. That night, for the first time in 2 years, Sophia slept without nightmares. Edward sat by her bed for an hour, just watching her breathe peacefully, allowing himself to believe that maybe finally the worst was truly over. The following years brought normalcy, a different kind of normalcy, marked by awareness and presence, but normalcy nonetheless. Sophia grew up, made friends, and got good grades in school again. She still went to therapy occasionally, but more for maintenance than urgent need. She still had hard days, unexpected triggers that brought back memories, but she had tools to cope, support to turn to, and love to sustain her. Edward rebuilt his company, smaller but more solid. He learned to delegate, to trust again, but with more wisdom. He never again traveled for more than a week at a time. He never again prioritized business over presence. The scars of those months remained, but they were scars that taught, that shaped, that transformed. The Sophia Center flourished, helping dozens of children each year. It became a benchmark in New York, a model replicated in other cities. Success stories began to emerge. Children who arrived broken and left whole, not without marks, not without memories, but whole nonetheless. One autumn afternoon, 5 years after that first night of horror, Edward and Sophia were at the farm in the Berkshires. They had returned a few times, turning the place into a positive refuge, replacing tense memories with moments of peace. They were sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains orange and purple. Sophia, now 13, was taller, more mature, but still the same essential girl she had always been. "Daddy, do you regret marrying her? How things went?" Edward thought carefully before answering. "I regret not seeing the truth sooner, that you suffered because of my blindness. But you know what I don't regret? Fighting for you. Risking everything when I finally understood. Because I learned something important. True love isn't perfect, it's not without mistakes. It's about getting up when you fall. It's about fighting when it matters. It's about choosing to be present, even when it's hard." He put his arm around her shoulders. "And I learned that you are the strongest person I know, stronger than I will ever be. And I'm grateful for that. For you. For us surviving. For being here now." Sophia snuggled into her father's embrace, the two of them watching in silence as day turned to night, as the stars began to appear one by one in the New England sky. That first night of horror, which had begun with a drop of blood on the ice and frozen tears on a child's face, had transformed into something different. Not forgotten, it would never be forgotten, but understood, healed, purposeful. Sometimes the most important story isn't about how we fall, it's about how we get back up. It's not about the winter that froze us, but about the spring we choose to build afterward. It's not about the pain we endured, but about the love that sustained us through it. And as father and daughter sat together under that starry sky, connected by experiences, No one should have, but that they survived together. One thing was clear. They had won. Not without loss, not without scars, but they had won. And that victory, built on resilience, love, and the conscious choice to keep going, was the kind of victory no one could ever take away. The winter had finally passed. And though Edward knew other winters would come because life always brings challenges, he also knew that now he was prepared, that Sophia was prepared, that together they could face any storm. And sometimes that certainty was enough. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Edward and Sophia has touched your hearts deeply. If you were moved by this journey of pain and resilience, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment struck you the most. Every day we bring you intense stories like this one, revealing the deepest side of the human soul, the capacity to resist, to heal, and to transform tragedy into purpose. We'll see you in the next episode, where new stories of life, love, and redemption await to touch your soul.